Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session of SecPod webcast. I'm Jagsir, your host. Through SecPod webcast, we bring you the latest happenings at SecPod and exciting stuff that we work on to prevent cyber attacks for enterprise IT security teams and globally. Today's session is going to be on uncovering vulnerabilities beyond software vulnerabilities, and we have our amazing presenter, our Chandra Shekhar, founder and CEO of SecPod. Chandra will talk to you about an interesting topic about vulnerability management. I'm excited to listen. Hope you're hooked up too. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all that the recorded version of this webinar will be available on our Bright Talk channel as well as our YouTube channel. We will also send a recording to your email after the session, so you can watch it and share with others with your team in your team. Towards the end of the session, Chandra would love to get your questions and answer them. And you can post your questions in the chat box just below your Bright Talk video player. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Over to you, Chandra. Audience is all yours.
All right, thank you, Jagsir. Hey everyone, thanks for joining our session today. Our session is uncovering vulnerabilities beyond software vulnerabilities, especially in the context of the evolving attacks that are taking place. It is extremely important to understand what vulnerabilities are and how do we prevent attacks from happening by mitigating these vulnerabilities. So, vulnerability management is a familiar term to all of us. Vulnerability management is all about identifying the loopholes or weaknesses before an attacker could exploit those weaknesses and mitigating those weaknesses. So, that is the, the essence of vulnerability management. So the purpose of session today is to see if there are vulnerabilities that go beyond software vulnerabilities. And that is the core of our webinar today. I'd like to uncover different kinds of vulnerabilities that are actually being exploited in different attacks that are occurring today, and try and possibly name those or categorize those vulnerabilities. And at the end, we will look at how do we understand these vulnerabilities and how do we mitigate those vulnerabilities. So, first of all, vulnerability is a security loophole that can be exploited by cyber criminals to gain unauthorized access to the network. And this is a general definition. So, any cyber attacks, if you were to analyze, there are weaknesses that are being exploited invariably. And that is how an attacker could get an entry into the organization's network, and that is how an attacker could travel from one system to another until the attacker is able to gain access to the system or the data that the attacker is looking for. And this is a well-known thing. So any attack, whether it is cyber attack or physical attack, there is a vulnerability that is being exploited by the attacker. Now the question is, software vulnerability is well known. Is it sufficient to prevent cyber attacks if we are able to understand or uncover these software vulnerabilities and mitigate those? Is that enough? So that is the primary question that we are asking today. Now, let's look at some of the attacks that are exploiting different kinds of vulnerabilities as I list here. So it can be an untrusted application that is present in the environment. It can be a DNS cache that is actually poisoned, or it can be a presence of a sensitive information hard coded in a script or a PowerShell script that is used to, generally automate the IT infrastructure. Or it could be a security control that is not functioning the way you would want to, And bypassing these security controls is also one of the exploit technique. So these are some of the popular ones that we have listed them here based on the recent attacks that have taken place. So the VPN software is widely used in the today's context with people working connecting from different places. So there are weaknesses in that, or the techniques that are being used uh, within the VPN establishment can be exploited, or it can be account privileges that are not set properly. So the different kinds of uh, weaknesses are being exploited by attackers today. And if you look at the MITRE's attack framework, these are some of the sample techniques that are being adopted by the attackers to perform or conduct an attack. So logon auto start execution, DNS, DHCP spoofing, startup folders having malicious entries, or kernel modules and extensions are also being used in a privileged escalation type of a scenario. Logon scripts are also being used to persist an attack, or it can be a browser extensions or clipboard data. Cloud discovery services are also being used as an attack technique. So command and script interpreters like the PowerShell that I mentioned, or even the script execution, the interpreters today are more or less available in most of the operating system. These are bundled default Python or VB script or JavaScript. So it can also be the web services or cloud services that are being used by the organizations, network shares which are publicly accessible or even within the organization's environment, network shares are widely open, or weak security certificate or PKI certificates, maybe a snake oil type of an encryption algorithm is being used. Now, outdated TLS or SSL versions are being used, or weaker encryption standards are being adopted. So, all of these are different attack techniques as listed in the MITRE attack frameworks. It can also be a file and directory permissions which are not configured properly. So these are techniques that are being used. So likewise, there are hundreds of such techniques documented widely by the MITRE attack within the MITRE attack framework. So what we gather from these attack techniques is it's not just the software vulnerabilities that we must be worried about. We actually need to go beyond and look at different attack techniques and look at attackers' perspective and see what they are actually exploiting, what kind of weaknesses are being exploited by the attackers, and apply a preventive prevention strategies based on what attackers are exploiting. Now, thus, vulnerabilities must be redefined. What are vulnerabilities? Of course, software vulnerability is a key component in different kinds of categories of vulnerabilities, if I say. So, this is typically the entry point for most attackers. So, software vulnerabilities must be identified. Misconfigurations is another category of vulnerabilities where certain applications or operating systems, etc., are not being configured appropriately. Asset exposure is another category of vulnerabilities where your IT environment is exposed to the public infrastructure, or within the environment itself, there are a number of things that are discoverable. Maybe we are using things that are not supposed to be present in the environment. The fourth category is the missing security patches. And the fifth one is somewhat new security controls that are employed within the organization's IT infrastructure. Are they working as expected? Or there could be anomalies present in the IT infrastructure. And Most important one is also human weakness, which is also being exploited widely by the attackers. So I've done a best possible listing of all possible, all categories of vulnerabilities, from software vulnerabilities to misconfiguration, asset exposure, missing security patches, security control deviations or posture related anomalies, or human weaknesses. So each of these are being attacked. Each of these weaknesses are being exploited by the attackers today, as we saw in the attack techniques or some of the popular attacks, widely published attacks that have taken in the recent past. So if we analyze these are categories of vulnerabilities that we end up learning about. Now, let me talk about these vulnerabilities in a little more detail. So, software vulnerabilities, as we know, Log4j is widely known to everybody. Microsoft Exchange servers were widely exploited, having a vulnerabilities in them, and we continue to have these problems even today. Number of unpatched Microsoft Exchange servers are exposed to the internet. And then Spring for Shell is another popular vulnerability that was widely exploited. So these are some of the examples. So if you look at vulnerabilities that are being discovered on a day-to-day basis, at least about 40 to 50 newer vulnerabilities are added on a daily basis into the software vulnerability repository or database. And that is a humongous number. So with the changing IT landscape, newer kinds of infrastructure elements coming in, and the vulnerabilities in each of these software that are installed on each of them are increasing day to day. And each year's data, if you look at NIST and VD itself, there are huge number of vulnerabilities that are kind of growing month on month, year on year. And there are, of course, there are a number of vulnerabilities that are not even published in the vulnerability database. So there are a good number of vulnerabilities that are not known to the world, can be a zero-day vulnerability, or vulnerability databases are not actually up to date. So this is, of course, one kind of vulnerability. Let's look at misconfigurations and see what they are. Misconfigurations are uh, security hardening measures that are made available within the operating system or the applications or the server software that are installed on different IT environment. So an example could be a password policy which is not implemented, allows weaker passwords to be employed by the users, or the Microsoft SMB shares are publicly accessible without having to authenticate. Anonymous access is available, or outdated protocols are being exploited, or sorry, employed, like SMB v1 is an example, or SSH v1 or TLS v1. All of these are outdated protocols which are known to be vulnerable. And another example could be a world writable file with umask set for complete access. So if any new file or executable created in a directory will have this world writable file permissions. So if you look at Microsoft Windows operating system itself, there are at least 400 to 500 different security configurations that can be done or performed to harden the system. But in default implementation, most of these are unhardened. So this is again equally important to understand and harden these misconfigurations in order to prevent cyber attacks, as equally important as software vulnerabilities that we talked in the previous slide. Let's look at IT asset exposure. Some of these are, if you look at an attacker's perspective, the first thing that that attacker would want to do is reconnaissance, gather information about the infrastructure, understand what is installed, what devices are present, what is listening, I mean, what kind of ports are open, etc. So there's a number of such information that a user would be able to learn about before conducting an attack. So maybe we are using an end of life software or untrusted executables are present in the environment. Unnecessarily ports could be listening, or services are running for no reason, or there are IT assets that are exposed to the public internet without proper firewall policies. So all of these can be asset exposures that need to be understood, and appropriate measures must be implemented to eliminate these kinds of vulnerability. Now, the fourth category is missing security patches. Of course, software vulnerabilities is related to security patches because you have vulnerability and you need to apply the patches to mitigate those vulnerability. I've listed them as a separate category because it's important to understand from the IT operations point of view what are those patches that are missing or not updated, and what vulnerabilities are being exploited if we don't apply. So that sense of prioritization is required to roll out the security updates to production environment or the endpoint devices that are present within the environment. So not patching them will obviously lead to massive cyber attacks. And the fifth category is the security control deviations or anomalies present in the environment. So number of those techniques that are being employed by the attackers are to evade the detection or to persist and attack within unnoticed within the environment. So most of the attack techniques are using some of these vulnerabilities. So maybe IP forwarding is enabled in a device, or firewall is accidentally disabled. Maybe the antivirus or anti-malware product that is deployed within the organization is turned off or not configured properly. Device encryption is supposed to be enabled, maybe it is turned off on our critical servers or critical systems. So there can be such security controls that are supposed to be working but are not working, can be the deviation or security control deviation that needs to be looked at. But there are other kinds of vulnerabilities which are more of anomaly. Let's say you are supposed to have whitelisted applications present. Ensure that only whitelisted applications are installed within the environment. Did we actually look at them, review them, and approve all of them? Maybe the services that are running within the environment, are they supposed to be running? Maybe the environmental variables are registry run once type of entries present in the Windows registry. Did we review those and actually seen that those are supposed to be present in the environment? So a number of these types of vulnerabilities are also being exploited by the attackers. So it's actually important to learn about them and whitelist them, or be aware that these are running and they're not supposed to be running. Then you'll have option or chances to mitigate those. And finally, human weakness are also being exploited. Recent attack that took place actually gained unauthorized access through an employee's personal vault, security vault. So that is one of the widely published attack, but most of the attacks that are taking place will have some sort of a human angle as well. So someone clicked on something accidentally, or someone was persuaded to perform some operation without their knowledge. So each of these need to be understood. Of course, the technology cannot help here in mitigating the human weaknesses, but something that needs to be understood by the organization. Appropriate training must be given to ensure that there is a behavioral pattern within the organization that must be adopted. So if you look at all of these six different category of vulnerabilities are actually uh, are present in different computing infrastructure that we use. So maybe there is external exposed IT assets, enterprise computing infrastructure from servers that are present within the on-premise, from personal devices that are without a perimeter, or maybe the cloud services that we are using, or the applications that are SaaS applications that are being used, cloud infrastructure itself. So, if you look at a typical the IT landscape of an organization, all of these are typically present for most of the organization. So, including the OT and IoT type of infrastructure. So it is important to understand different kinds of vulnerabilities and the IT landscape that an organization has, and understand all of these vulnerabilities, presence of these vulnerabilities within this IT landscapes across. It's not just the on-premise computing infrastructure, but also the cloud infrastructure, and also personal devices, and also OT and IoT environment if there is one. So at SecPod, we have come up with an advanced vulnerability management framework, or a next generation vulnerability management framework for this very purpose, to identify different kinds of vulnerabilities across different IT landscape and have the opportunity to mitigate those vulnerabilities. So a complete end-to-end vulnerability management lifecycle is presented in this framework. So it has six different layers, starting with visibility, which is to get continuous visibility to the computing infrastructure, to the entire IT landscape. It is important to know what is there, what is exposed unintentionally or intentionally, and what is running on them, or they're supposed to be running, etc. So this is where it's essential to not just do a one-time exercise to learn about the environment, but it has to be an automated process. It has to be a continuous process where we get visibility to the IT environment. In the second layer, identify, we need to learn about, once we learn about the IT infrastructure, it is essential to perform a discovery scan to understand different kinds of vulnerability this IT landscape is exposed to, starting from vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, missing security patches, security anomalies, and security control deviations. All of these must be understood as part of the scanning activity. So once you discover these vulnerabilities, it is important to perform an assessment and know from a risk perspective what these vulnerabilities are, what is the impact of having these vulnerability, can these be exploited by the attackers, only to prioritize these vulnerabilities in order to roll out a mitigation a plan, a mitigation strategy. So once you learn about the vulnerabilities, so here are the most critical vulnerabilities probably being exploited in the wild, and you need to apply security mitigation or security control that eliminates that vulnerability. So that is part of the prioritization layer. And finally, in the remediation part, it is important to not only mitigate software vulnerability by rolling out software patches, but also fix misconfigurations, apply security controls that go beyond patching, from stopping unwanted applications and services, and applying proper policies, maybe firewall policies for the inbound traffic, etc. So there are a number of those security controls that can be applied or performed to eliminate these different kinds of vulnerability that we talked about. So focusing on just applying the software patches is not enough. It is important to apply different kinds of remediations that go beyond patching. And then in the reporting layer, it's about demonstrating compliance to the guidelines an organization has employed, whether it's a regulatory compliance expectation or a framework like NIST cybersecurity framework, etc. So it is important to demonstrate and show compliance to different frameworks. So that's where reporting becomes extremely important. No, although all these layers are operating in different are depicted in different boxes, each of them need to come together. Identify, for example, identify needs to feed into prioritization and remediation layer, and each of these need to be a continuous and automated process. It cannot be a manual intervention at every layer. This has to be a daily activity performed through automation as much as possible, and it has to be a continuous and automated process. So, this is the framework that we have within SecPod. SanerNow as a product adopts this framework end to end. SanerNow Cyber Hygiene Framework is able to provide visibility to the IT environment, a continuous visibility, able to identify vulnerabilities of different kinds that I described previously, and perform an assessment and prioritize those vulnerabilities based on uh, the intelligence that we feed into the platform. And within the same framework or same platform, we have the remediation controls that can be applied to eliminate this vulnerability, from patching vulnerability to fixing misconfigurations and applying security controls that go beyond patching, and then a report to demonstrate compliance to a particular guideline or a standard that an organization has adopted. So SanerNow Cyber Hygiene platform is built with a single focus philosophy, preventing cyber attacks, and to make it a continuous and automated process. That comes to the end of what I wanted to talk to you all today. Uh, Open to any questions. Jixir, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chandra. It was really interesting to know all the kinds of vulnerabilities that an IT security team should look into. And definitely, the framework only enhances the methodology and implementation of such a strategy. Uh, just looking at the question. So one question I get from the audience is, you talked about the importance of looking into all kinds of all of these vulnerabilities. Can you share some light on there are customers who would be also interested in knowing if they are not looking at any of these amongst all the types of vulnerabilities that you talked about, what are the kind of risks that they are living with?
All right. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So, if you look at the attack techniques adopted by the attackers, typically it begins with reconnaissance, where you want to gather information about the environment, gain initial access into the network, and then execute the malicious code that is part of the plan that you have built. And then how do I persist, be in the environment as long as possible in order to actually conduct the attack that was part of the plan, maybe perform escalation or privilege escalation to get to the level or the permission level that will allow me to perform the attack. And then maybe it involves evading a defense mechanism to avoid being detected, and then perform a lateral movement going from one system to another system, and then collect the data that is intended or even cause impact, like the ransomware attackers typically employ. It can also involve command and control and exfiltration. So these are different stages of an attack. A typical attacker would employ. So if you look at all of these different stages, typically software vulnerabilities are being exploited in gaining initial access. So which is typically the entry point for most attackers. But in all of the stages that I talked about, there are different kinds of risks that are being exploited, from misconfigurations for lateral movement type of a scenario, for example, or code execution. There are different ways that someone could execute a code. Maybe there is an interpreter that is pre-installed, or there are run launch D type of configurations that are present that can be employed to launch a particular executable. So in each of these stages, different kinds of vulnerabilities are being exploited, and not just software vulnerability. So I would say, in short, not just software vulnerabilities. It is important to redefine what vulnerabilities are, and then pay equal attention to all the other risks that we talked about.
Okay, interesting. Thanks for that perspective, Chandra. I think with that one other question, I think that would be of interest. Would be, you talked about looking at all these types of vulnerabilities to be able to expose as much as a risk a team can get visibility into. Having all of this visibility certainly definitely gives more certainty about the risk that the team has visibility and can manage. That comes to your second point that you presented to us in the framework that you were talking about, the remediation, which I think is another is a critical has a critical role to play in this whole process. Can you shed some light on how exposing all of these risks makes the remediation better for the team that is trying to look into all of these types of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so when you look at remediation, typically starts with rolling out security patches. So that is one of the remediation mechanism that is being employed to mitigate the software vulnerabilities. But even for software vulnerabilities, there are certain checks or controls that you must apply in order to actually eliminate the vulnerability fully. Maybe there are certain security settings that you want to change. Maybe there are some scripts that you want to run as part of your remediation activity to mitigate that vulnerability fully. And there are certain services that are running, for example, unwanted services, and you want to actually stop those services. So what I'm getting to is it is essential to have remediation software updates part of the remediation strategy, but it is also extremely important to have those controls that go beyond software patches, from having ability to uninstall unwanted application, making changes to the Windows registry, for example, or ability to run certain scripts to harden the system. So each of these play extremely important role. Another problem that I typically see is that you have a vulnerability assessment exercise being done to uncover vulnerabilities, but there is a disjointed approach available to mitigate the vulnerability. So that is one kind of a friction that is there in order to, it kind of comes in the way of applying automated approach to remediation. So if you have a solution that can integrate these vulnerability detection to the remediation, so this process can be smoothened out and significant portion of this can be automated to run it as a continuous activity.
Perfect. I think that could be another interesting topic we can delve into more depth in our upcoming sessions. And in fact, I think from your session, I pick up one another thing since you talked about various stages of attacks and then how these vulnerabilities play a respective role in those stages. Definitely, that could be another interesting session that I can invite a guest to talk about. With that, I think we can wrap up today's session. Thanks a lot, Chandra, for your perspective on the vulnerability, the types of vulnerabilities, and any IT security team should not just get visibility into, but should have a proper plan to remediate those on time. Thank you on our audience's behalf. Once again, we will have a recorded session available on Bright Talk and our YouTube channel. We will also send you an email with the exact URL to these recordings. And please keep tuned to SecPod webcast. We'll see you on our next session. Thanks for your valuable time. We wish you a happy time ahead.
Thank you, Jaxir. Thanks to the audience for having this. I really enjoyed having this opportunity to talk to all of you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.